The original owner of this body died on a Tuesday, choking on the bitter taste of a poisoned cup of tea, weeping for a man who had never looked at him with anything but disgust. He died on the cold wooden floor of the forgotten northern pavilion, clutching a piece of torn silk that used to belong to the Crown Prince. He died of poison, yes, but mostly, I think, he died of a broken heart. And then, I woke up in his place. Before we begin this story, I want to take a small moment to talk to you directly. If you want the full continuation of these stories, more uncensored 18+ Ancient BL content, extended scenes, and unlimited royal forbidden romance, you can join us on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. YouTube does not allow us to show or monetize everything freely here, so the deeper, darker, and more intense versions of these stories are waiting for you there.
You can find the link in the description and the pinned comment. Now, take a deep breath. Let the modern world fade away. Listen to the rain on the palace roof, and let me tell you my story. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I felt was the freezing stone against my cheek.
The second thing I felt was a ghost of an ache in my chest, a heavy, suffocating sorrow that belonged to a boy who no longer existed. I sat up slowly. I coughed up the last remnants of the poisoned tea, wiped my mouth with the back of my hand, and looked around. I was not in my modern apartment. There were no electric lights, no hum of traffic outside the window. I was surrounded by peeling red pillars, tattered white silk curtains, and the overwhelming scent of dusty sandalwood. I was a man who used to design bridges in a world of steel and glass. Now, looking down at my long, pale hands, dressed in ruined, cheap silk robes, I realized I had inherited someone else's tragedy. I inherited his name, Ren. I inherited his status as a political hostage forced into an unconsummated marriage with the Crown Prince of the Great Jian Kingdom. And, unfortunately, I inherited the memories of his absolutely pathetic, desperate, and unrequited love. The original Ren had spent 3 years begging for Crown Prince Jian's attention. He had written him poems, he had knelt in the snow. He had endured the mockery of the court, the slaps of jealous concubines, and the cold, unfeeling stare of the prince himself. I stood up. The floorboards creaked. I walked over to a cracked bronze mirror and looked at my new face. He was beautiful, in a fragile, tragic sort of way. Pale skin, dark, sorrowful eyes, lips that looked like they were used to trembling. I stared at the reflection, and I made a decision. I am not him. The desperate, weeping boy who loved a cruel prince dissolved the moment I took my first breath in this chest. I don't care about court politics. I don't care about royal favor, and I certainly do not care about Crown Prince Jian. An hour later, the wooden doors of the northern pavilion were kicked open. The wind howled through the courtyard, bringing with it the sharp, biting chill of early winter. A group of heavily armed royal guards stepped aside, and the Crown Prince walked in. Crown Prince Jian was a man whose presence consumed the air in a room. I knew from the original's memories that he was tall, but seeing him with my own eyes was different. He was devastatingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, dark eyes that looked like freezing water, and a jawline carved from marble. He wore heavy black and gold robes that swept across the floor, smelling of pine needles, expensive incense, and battlefield steel. He looked at me, standing near the window, and his eyes narrowed in immediate irritation. "You are not dead," Jian said. His voice was deep, resonant, the kind of voice that made generals kneel, but it was laced with utter disappointment. The original Ren would have thrown himself at the prince's feet, crying, explaining that someone had tried to poison him, begging for the prince to care. I looked at him. I really looked at him. I assessed the broadness of his shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his chin, the sheer entitlement radiating from his stance. I felt a flicker of the original's heartbeat flutter in my chest, a phantom reflex of love. I mentally crushed it. "As you can see, Your Highness," I said, my voice completely steady, "I am inconveniently alive. I apologize for ruining your morning." The silence that followed was heavy. The guards shifted uncomfortably. Prince Jian stared at me, his dark brows furrowing. This was not the script. I was supposed to be crying. "I received word that you drank from a tainted pot," Jian said coldly, stepping further into the room. He towered over me, a physical intimidation tactic that probably worked very well on the original. "I came to ensure my kingdom would not be blamed for the sudden death of a useless hostage." "How pragmatic of you," I replied pleasantly. I turned away from him and walked over to the small, miserable table in the corner. I picked up the cracked teapot. "Would you like me to write a confession stating that I poisoned myself by accident? That way, if I die tomorrow, the royal family's hands remain clean." Jian stepped closer. The scent of pine and cold air wrapped around me. I could feel the heat radiating from his large body, a stark contrast to the freezing room. Look at me when I am speaking to you, he commanded softly. I placed the teapot down. I turned slowly and met his gaze. I didn't tremble. I didn't look down. I looked directly into his eyes with the mild, detached interest of a man looking at a slightly annoying puzzle. I am looking at you, Your Highness, I said. Is there something else? Because my tea is cold, my throat hurts, and I would very much like to sit down. Jian's jaw tightened. I saw a flicker of something cross his eyes. Confusion. Disorientation. The man he had ignored and despised for 3 years was gone, replaced by a stranger wearing his face. He didn't know what to do with my indifference, so he chose cruelty. Since you are well enough to speak back, Jian sneered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You are well enough to pack. Your presence in the main palace is an eyesore. You are being relocated to the Western Courtyard, at the very edge of the palace grounds. Do not show your face at court again. He expected me to break. The Western Courtyard was a place of exile. It was where forgotten concubines were sent to rot. The original Wren would have died on the spot from the shame. I simply nodded. Understood. Will a cart be provided for my belongings, or should I carry them myself? Jian stared at me. He looked at my calm face, searching for the tears, the trembling lip, the desperate grab at his robes. He found nothing. Carry them yourself, he spat, turning on his heel. His black robes flared around him as he stormed out of the pavilion. The doors slammed shut behind him. I stood in the quiet room. I exhaled slowly, feeling the phantom weight of the original's grief finally leave my bones. Well, I whispered to the empty room. That went well. Life in the Western Courtyard was quiet. The courtyard was overgrown with weeds, the roof leaked, and the paper screens were torn. But to me, it was perfect. It was mine. I am an architect by nature. I like fixing things. I spent the first month repairing the paper screens with rice paste. I cleared the weeds from the courtyard and found a small, neglected plum tree hidden beneath the overgrowth. I bargained with a sympathetic kitchen servant, a young boy named Li, trading my useless gold hairpins for seeds, fresh vegetables, and decent tea. I stopped wearing the complicated, heavy silk robes that the original wore to impress the prince. I wore simple, faded blue cotton. I tied my hair back with a plain ribbon. I woke up with the sun, drank my tea, read the ancient medical and historical texts I found in the dusty library, and tended to my garden. I was happy. I was genuinely, profoundly at peace. But peace, in a royal palace, is an illusion. It started subtly. 2 months into my exile, the provisions from the kitchen suddenly improved. Instead of stale rice and wilted cabbage, Lee started bringing me fresh fish, expensive white rice, and jars of sweet preserved plums. Where did this come from, Lee? I asked one afternoon, looking at a beautiful celadon bowl filled with hot, fragrant soup. Lee looked down, shuffling his feet. The head chef, young master, he was ordered to send better portions to the Western Courtyard. Ordered by whom? Lee swallowed hard. By His Highness, the Crown Prince. I looked at the soup. A thin curl of steam rose from the surface. The original Wren would have wept over this soup. He would have eaten it like a holy sacrament, believing it was a sign of love. I picked up the bowl, walked to the edge of the courtyard, and poured it onto the roots of the plum tree. Tell the head chef, I said calmly, handing the empty bowl back to a terrified Lee, that my stomach cannot handle rich foods. The plain rice is fine. Word must have traveled fast. The very next evening, the wooden gate of my courtyard creaked open. I was sitting on the porch, reading a book by the light of a single candle. The air was warm with the approaching spring, and the scent of the plum blossoms was sweet and heavy. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The heavy, deliberate footsteps. The sudden shift in the air pressure, the smell of pine and cold metal. Crown Prince Jian stood in my courtyard. He was out of his formal court attire, wearing a simple but exquisitely tailored dark robe. He looked like a shadow standing among my plum blossoms. He looked at the repaired screens, the swept stones, the neat row of herbs growing in clay pots. He looked at this life I had built without him, and his expression was unreadable. You refused the food, he said. His voice was lower than I remembered, softer, lacking the sharp edge of cruelty. I prefer what I make myself, I replied, turning a page of my book. I didn't stand up to bow. I didn't offer him a seat. Jian walked slowly toward the porch. He stepped up, his tall frame looming over me. He looked down at the book in my lap, then at my hands. Your hands are calloused, he noted, his voice tight. You have been doing servant's work. I have been doing my own work, I corrected him. Is there a reason you are here, Your Highness? The Western Courtyard is far from your chambers. I wouldn't want you to tire your legs for no reason. He ignored my sarcasm. He stepped closer. Too close. The toe of his boot brushed against the hem of my faded blue robe. He reached down. I thought he was going to take the book, but instead, his large, warm hand closed over my wrist. The touch sent a sudden, shocking jolt of electricity up my arm. His fingers were rough from holding a sword, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. The heat of his skin against my cool wrist was intensely distracting. "Let go of me," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. Jian didn't let go. Instead, his thumb slowly brushed against my pulse point. He could feel my heart beating. I prayed it was beating steadily. "You have changed, Ren," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto mine. There was a strange, dark hunger in his gaze now, something predatory and confused. "You used to look at me like I was the sun. Now you look at me like I am a stain on your floor. Why?" I looked down at his hand on my wrist, then I looked back up at his handsome, tormented face. "Because the man who looked at you like the sun died in the northern pavilion," I said softly. "You killed him with your indifference. The man sitting before you now simply does not care." Jian's breath hitched. His grip on my wrist tightened for a fraction of a second, his knuckles turning white, before he suddenly let go as if I had burned him. He stepped back, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes wide with a realization he wasn't ready to name. He looked at my lips, then at my eyes, and without another word, he turned and practically fled into the night. I rubbed my wrist. The skin there felt too warm. I picked up my book, but I found that I couldn't concentrate on the words anymore. And if you are enjoying this forbidden royal tension, remember, the extended and uncensored 18+ continuation of these kinds of stories is available on Patreon at SpicyAncientBL. If you want to know exactly what happens when the prince can no longer keep his hands to himself behind closed doors, the link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. After that night, Jian became a haunting presence in my life. He didn't speak to me. He didn't summon me, but I felt him everywhere. When I walked to the royal library to exchange my books, I would feel the weight of a gaze on the back of my neck. I would turn around and see him standing at the end of a long, sunlit corridor, watching me silently. When it rained, I would find expensive, waterproof oil paper umbrellas leaning against my wooden gate. I left them there until they rotted. The palace court was beginning to whisper. The crown prince, who was known for his cold, unfeeling nature, was suddenly distracted. He was rejecting the beautiful men and women offered to his harem. He was spending hours staring at maps of the Western Palace grounds. I ignored it all. I built a wall of absolute politeness around myself, a shield of ice that Jian's burning gaze could not melt. But then came the Night of the Thousand Lanterns. It was the emperor's birthday, the largest festival of the year. The entire palace was illuminated by thousands of floating silk lanterns, turning the sky into a river of gold. As a member of the royal family, even a forgotten hostage, I was required to attend the grand banquet. I dressed simply in a pale gray robe, keeping my eyes downcast, intending to sit at the furthest table, eat my meal, and leave unnoticed. But when I entered the grand hall, the head eunuch intercepted me. "Master Ren," he bowed deeply, "His Highness has requested that you sit at his side tonight." The hall fell dead silent. Hundreds of nobles, generals, and concubines turned to look at me. At the front of the room, sitting on a raised dais, was Crown Prince Jian. He was dressed in crimson and gold, looking like a god of war descended from the heavens. His dark eyes were fixed on me, challenging me to refuse him in front of the entire court. I felt a headache forming behind my eyes. I walked slowly up the center aisle. I could hear the whispers. "Isn't that the discarded hostage?" I heard the prince despised him. "Why is he sitting beside him? Look at how plain he is dressed. How insulting." I reached the dais. I offered a perfect, shallow, emotionally vacant bow. I sat down on the silk cushion to Jian's right. "You came," Jian said softly. His voice meant only for my ears. "I was summoned," I replied, pouring myself a cup of plain water. I did not want to cause a scene. "You are wearing gray," he noted, his eyes trailing over the simple curve of my neck, the plain line of my collar. "I sent 3 trunks of silk to the Western Courtyard yesterday. Red, blue, gold. I am comfortable in gray," I said, bringing the cup to my lips. Jian leaned closer. Underneath the table, hidden by the long drape of the tablecloth, I felt his knee press against mine. I froze. The contact was electric. The heat of his body burned through the layers of our clothing. I tried to pull my leg away, but he shifted, trapping my knee between his, locking me in place. I turned my head to glare at him. His face was perfectly stoic, looking out at the dancers in the center of the hall, but his jaw was clenched, and a small muscle feathered in his cheek. "What are you doing?" I whispered sharply. Sitting with my husband, he replied smoothly, turning his head to look at me. His face was only inches from mine. I could smell the wine on his breath, sweet and intoxicating. Is that a crime? It is when you spent 3 years making sure the world knew you hated him, I shot back. His eyes darkened. The teasing glint vanished, replaced by an overwhelming, suffocating intensity. He reached under the table. His large, warm hand found my thigh. I stopped breathing. His fingers gripped the fabric of my robe, his thumb brushing dangerously close to the inside of my leg. It wasn't an aggressive grip, it was desperate. It was the grip of a man drowning, holding on to the only piece of wood in the ocean. I don't hate you, he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. I never hated you. I was afraid of what you made me feel. I stared into his dark eyes, lit by the golden light of 1,000 lanterns. For a second, just a fraction of a second, I felt the ice around my heart crack. The sheer vulnerability in the eyes of this terrifying warlord was intoxicating. But before I could reply, the air in the hall shifted. The dancers in the center of the room spun in a blur of colored silk, but something was wrong. Their movements were too sharp. Their eyes were too focused. In a single, terrifying heartbeat, 3 of the dancers drew hidden, curved blades from beneath their sashes. They didn't leap toward the emperor. They leaped toward the dais. They leaped toward Crown Prince Jian. Everything moved in slow motion. I am not a warrior. I have no martial arts training, but my mind operates on cold, architectural logic. I calculated the trajectory of the assassin's blade. I saw that Jian's sword was tangled in his heavy ceremonial robes. He wouldn't draw it in time. If Jian died, the kingdom would fall into a bloody war of succession. Thousands would die. I didn't think about love. I didn't think about sacrifice. I just reacted. I threw my body sideways, slamming into Jian's chest, knocking him backward off his cushion. The assassin's blade sliced through the air exactly where Jian's throat had been a second before. Instead, the sharp steel tore through the shoulder of my gray robe, biting deep into my flesh. Pain, hot and blinding, exploded down my arm. I gasped, falling onto the floor of the dais. Chaos erupted. Screams filled the hall. The royal guards surged forward, clashing with the assassins in a storm of steel and blood. But I didn't hear any of it. All I felt were 2 massive, trembling arms wrapping tightly around me. Jian pulled me into his lap, his hands frantically pressing against my bleeding shoulder. "Ren!" Jian roared, a sound torn from the very depths of his soul. It was a sound of absolute, unhinged terror. I looked up at his face. The cold, arrogant crown prince was gone. His eyes were wide with panic, his hands stained with my blood. He was shaking. The man who had slaughtered armies without blinking was trembling, holding me. "I'm fine," I tried to say, but my voice was a weak rasp. "Medic!" Jian screamed, his voice shaking the pillars of the hall. He looked down at me, his tears falling hot against my cheek. "Stay awake. Look at me. Look at me, Ren. Why did you do that? Why would you take a blade for me?" I blinked slowly, fighting the darkness closing in on my vision. I looked into his desperate, weeping eyes. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to tell him it was just a calculation, a pragmatic choice to prevent a war. But as his tears hit my skin, as I felt the frantic, heavy beating of his heart against my chest, I realized maybe that wasn't the whole truth anymore. You are heavy," I mumbled, my eyes slipping shut. The last thing I felt before I lost consciousness was Jian pressing his lips frantically to my forehead, begging me not to leave him. When I woke up, the smell of dust and cheap sandalwood was gone. I was lying in a massive, incredibly soft bed, surrounded by heavy crimson silk curtains. The air smelled of expensive pine incense and burning herbs. The pain in my shoulder was a dull, throbbing ache, tightly bound in clean linen. I turned my head. Sitting in a chair beside the bed, still wearing his blood-stained ceremonial robes, was Crown Prince Jian. He looked like he had aged 10 years in a single night. His hair was undone, falling in a messy, dark waterfall over his shoulders. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. He was holding my good hand in both of his, pressing it against his lips. "You're awake," he whispered, his voice incredibly rough. He dropped my hand and leaned over me, his eyes searching my face as if checking to see if I was a ghost. "Where am I asked softly. "You are in my chambers," Jian said. "You have been asleep for 3 days. I thought, he choked on his words, turning his head away, struggling to maintain his composure. I watched him. The power dynamic in the room had shifted entirely. The arrogant prince who had banished me was gone. In his place was a man who had finally realized the value of what he had thrown away, only after he almost lost it permanently. The assassins? I asked. Dead. Dealt with, Jian said dismissively. He looked back at me, his eyes burning with an intense, desperate fire. Why, Ren? You told me you didn't care. You looked at me with ice in your eyes. So why did you throw yourself in front of a blade for me? He was begging for a confession of love. He was begging me to tell him that the original Ren was still inside me, that the boy who worshipped him was still alive. I looked at the ceiling. I could have lied. I could have given him what he wanted. Because it was logical, I said quietly. Jian flinched as if I had struck him across the face. If you die, the kingdom bleeds, I continued, my voice calm, factual, stripping the romance from the moment. Your brothers would tear the country apart. I live in this country. I prefer it peaceful. It was a reflex, Your Highness, nothing more. Silence fell over the massive royal chamber. The crackle of the braziers was the only sound. Jian slowly stood up from the chair. He looked down at me. The vulnerability in his face hardened, but not into anger. It hardened into a terrifying, stubborn resolve. Logical, he repeated softly, tasting the word. Yes. Jian nodded slowly. He leaned down, placing both his hands on the mattress on either side of my head, trapping me beneath him. The scent of pine and sweat and dark, overwhelming masculinity filled my senses. His face was inches from mine. I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. Then let me be logical, Jian whispered, his gaze dropping to my lips. You are my husband by law. You live in my palace. You bleed for my throne. I spent 3 years being a blind, arrogant fool, throwing away a pearl because I didn't understand its value. He reached up and with infinite gentleness, he brushed a stray lock of hair behind my ear. His fingers lingered on my jawline, a touch so tender it made my breath catch. You don't love me, Jian said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that went straight to my core. I accept that. The boy who loved me is gone, but you are here. And I am telling you now, Ren. I am going to spend the rest of my life making you look at me again, not with logic, not with indifference. I will burn down the world to warm your hands if I have to. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ice around my chest was melting, turning into a dangerous, sweeping current. You are insane, I whispered. Jian smiled. It wasn't the cruel smile of the Crown Prince. It was a devastating, beautiful smile of a man who had finally found a war worth fighting. For you? He murmured, leaning in until his lips brushed gently against the corner of my mouth, a ghost of a kiss that sent fire racing through my veins. Entirely. I didn't push him away. I didn't pull him closer. But as I lay in the prince's bed, listening to the rain begin to fall outside the high windows, I knew that my quiet, peaceful life in the Western Courtyard was over. A new game had begun, and this time, I wasn't a weeping victim. I was the prize, and the Crown Prince was finally willing to play by my rules. If you want the next part, the uncensored continuation, and more unlimited 18+ ancient royal BL stories, where this slow burn tension finally ignites behind closed palace doors, come join SpicyAncientBL on Patreon. The link is waiting for you in the description and pinned comment. Thank you for listening. Let the rain wash away the past, and I will see you in the next story.